You are listening to Kubernetes Bytes, a podcast bringing you the latest from the world of cloud-native data management. My name is Ryan Wallner, and I'm joined by Bhavin Shah, coming to you from Boston, Massachusetts. We'll be sharing our thoughts on recent cloud-native news and talking to industry experts about their experiences and challenges managing the wealth of data in today's cloud-native ecosystem. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. We're coming to you from Boston, Massachusetts. Today is December 5th, 2024. Hope everyone is doing well and staying safe. Bhavin, the year is almost over. You're back from your trip. How was it? How's it going?
Oh, yeah, the trip was good. It was busy for sure. A lot of travel.
Yeah.
I went back to India and then visited family there and visited family at a different place. So I packed a lot in 2 weeks. And Ryan, I know before we hit recording, I was telling you how like the fun that I had, or like the not so fun in my flight that I had.
Yeah, a long trip.
Yeah, long trip for sure. But no, I'm glad to be back. I'm not glad that it's cold again. Like
You came
20
back
degrees.
just
It snowed this morning.
Oh, you did? You got snow where you are too?
I did.
Look, I didn't know if it would go that far east.
Ground. Yeah, like nothing stuck, but like it was snowing. So
we got a couple inches out here near Worcester.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Okay.
Had to shovel the driveway and clear off my car this morning.
Okay. Yeah. So then I guess I'm thankful for that I didn't have to shovel this morning.
First snow of the year. Yeah. I know you were away on your trip and I had to do a last minute move. I moved my entire house and the people in it and the things in it. That's how it works. And so we have a little delay between our previous episode, but we're glad to be back just in time for the new year. I hope everyone is doing well and gets to take some time off with their families and whatnot coming up in the new year. Hopefully we'll have one more episode before the end of the year. We'll see.
Maybe two.
Maybe two. We'll see. Hang in there. We definitely owe everybody a news episode post KubeCon. Yes. So for this episode, we are also going to skip news. I know we did that before KubeCon as well. And we're just going to throw all the news at you in one news episode post KubeCon. So get ready for that coming up. But we do have a really interesting guest that's going to come on the show today. His name is Tobi Knaup. He was previously the CEO and co-founder of U2IQ, but he is the VP and General Manager of Cloud Native at Nutanix now. So I'm excited to have him on. What do you say we get him on the show, Bhavin?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, Tobi, welcome to Kubernetes Bytes. It's great to have you here. Why don't you give a little introduction of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. My name is Tobi Knaup. I'm currently the general manager for Cloud Native at Nutanix. So all things Kubernetes and Kubernetes related. I joined Nutanix about a year ago along with my team from Day2IQ. It's a company I co-founded. It was formerly known as Mesosphere. Started that company back in 2013. So, we were one of the first companies to do containers and Cloud Native back then.
Sure. Welcome.
I know Ryan is a big fan, or used to be a big fan of Mesosphere.
We used to be a big user.
Okay.
At a previous job, and I really did enjoy the product itself. But that was 2017, so I think that was sort of the go-to during that time frame.
Absolutely.
Tobi, it's great to have you on the pod, right? As Ryan said, I think with your background with Mesosphere and D2IQ and now with Nutanix, right? I want to pick your brain on like how do you see what do you think about where Kubernetes is today, and where do you see the next growth phase for Kubernetes coming from, and how do you see the next 5 years of Kubernetes? I know we are at the 10-year mark.
Yeah, it's the timeline really feels weird to me sometimes because as you said, Kubernetes just turned 10 years old, right? So that's quite a long time, right? And having been in the space for what feels like an eternity, 10 years of Kubernetes and then 5 years of Mesos before that. So it's been a decade and a half for me. It feels like this stuff's been around forever and it is everywhere. But, the reality is actually in a lot of large organizations in particular, like your mainstream enterprises, the amount of containers that people are using versus the amount of, other types of workloads like VMs, it's still a small percentage, right? I would guess it's in many organizations, it's only like 5% maybe of containers. And so I think over the next decade, of cloud native, we'll really see mainstream adoption. We'll see that percentage of containers to VMs flip. I think most organizations will be running more containers than VMs, maybe in the next 5 years, maybe it's 10 years. And I think the other thing that we're seeing is, we keep discovering new use cases for Kubernetes, right? Because think about it, it came out of Google, of course, and it's based on the ideas that Google uses to run their large online services, right? The Google services we use all the time, like mail and search and YouTube. So it's really built for that. So large data centers running large online services, but then, people just fell in love with that API and that way of doing things. And they put it on very small edge devices, right? Using, those small Kubernetes distributions. And of course, the new hot thing is to use Kubernetes for AI. I think it's quickly become the default platform for AI workloads. And so we'll see a ton of that going forward.
Nice. So I want to go back to the first point you made, right? Like the 5% maybe adoption inside bigger enterprises for containers. Why do you think that is? Like, do you think that's mostly like a skill gap, or it's like, if it's not broke, why move away from what you have been doing internally? Like, why do you think the reason for such a low adoption or penetration is?
Yeah, I think you gave the answer right there. It's, what I see in most organizations is people start with new applications that they put in containers, right? And if you look at how a large organization in particular functions, taking all of their existing apps and moving them into containers, it's not always a great value add for them, right? I've talked to some organizations and they estimate that if they do a platform shift like that, they'll have to spend about 40% of what the platform costs in additional, people time to just do that, right? Sure. And so given all the other things they have going on, like building new apps, right? Building new customer-facing applications, adopting AI and all the other things, that, usually takes a back seat. So I think that's a big part of the reason, there's just not too much value. Although we can, argue microservices versus monoliths and, breaking down the old monoliths and all that stuff. In the grand scheme of things for a large enterprise, not that much value there. So they focus on the new workloads. And then, of course, that's a relatively small percentage of things. And like you said, the skills gap is still very real.
And I agree, right? I think the new applications being built using containers and Kubernetes, I think that makes sense. Do you see a similar, and I promise we'll move on from this discussion, but I want to pick your brain on things, right? So do you see a scenario where maybe on-prem, they're not using as much containers, maybe for cloud, since it's managed, it becomes more easy? Like, is that something that we see as a difference between on-prem and cloud environments, or doesn't matter where you are?
Yeah, I don't have concrete data on that, but I think you're probably right that we'll see, a much larger percentage of containers versus VMs on the cloud, simply because that's where many organizations are doing their new developments and are building their new stuff. So yeah, that's probably right. Also, I think another aspect of this is, on the cloud, we're more used to kind of moving fast, rebuilding things, whereas on-prem, the teams that are managing those traditional on-prem environments, one of their main goals is really risk reduction, right?
Yeah.
So if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of approach. I think that plays into it too.
Yeah, it sure does. And I forget when, like, VMware, I know it was founded in the 90s, but Workstation 1.0, maybe 2000, I forget the actual, but that's been 20 plus years of, and that experience going from maybe bare metal and operating system to on top of it to VM and operating system might have been a little easier than breaking things into smaller microservices. I don't know. I just have this feeling that it might take a little longer, and we're only halfway through that comparison, right? When you look at virtual machines.
I think you're right, because the difference is, so, going from bare metal to VMs, a VM it still looks and feels like a machine, right? You have your operating system, it looks and feels the same.
Yeah.
But going from monoliths to microservices, you're really changing not just the technology, but your process, right? Your approach to building software and how you organize teams and all of that changes too. So that's a much, much bigger lift.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I want to go and pick on that AI piece that you mentioned, right? And maybe a little bit of the edge piece, right? We're starting to see more and more multi-cloud or edge workloads and those kind of things. And I'm curious in your perspective, right? Why it is that these different deployment scenarios, whether that be edge or hybrid cloud or multi-cloud, um, what is the importance to AI specifically as we're moving forward?
Yeah. So I think fundamentally what's behind edge in general is, there's the old saying we have in the industry that data has gravity, which means that it's generally easier to move your compute to your data versus the other way around, right? Move data to your compute. Moving data is just pretty expensive. You need big pipes, and the clouds charge a lot of money for egress.
Yeah, so, it might be easier to ship a FedEx truck than move it over the wire, right?
Exactly. And remember when AWS literally built a truck to move your data? So I think that's what's behind it. So, I talked to, like, even before the recent AI craze, I was talking to a lot of manufacturing customers, for example, who wanted to use the data that's coming out of their production environments, right? Like there's a paper company I talked to, for example, they have these massive paper machines with thousands of sensors built in. And, they want to use that data and run models on it to prevent, unplanned downtime and just run more efficiently and optimize, right? So there's a lot of data coming out of, these factories that are all over the world. And so they wanted to move compute into those factories to process that data and basically have the factory running autonomously, right? So they didn't want to take a dependency on the cloud because, if they lose their internet connection for some reason, that would impact production, which is, very costly. So there was a real, sort of blast radius and reliability consideration there. And at the same time, they were also running some compute on the cloud, right? So to aggregate data across all of the different locations and, figure out why one factory is more productive than the other and things like that. So I think that's generally always been a thing, right? Let's move compute to the data. And with AI, that's now even more true, right? Because AI, to simplify it down, you have training and you have inference. You have these two things. You train a model and then you run it with the new data. And training happens where you have large scale compute available, right? That might be on the cloud, or maybe you bought some gear and put it in your data center. But then inference happens where your new data shows up, and that's typically on the edge. And so, when you're building these AI applications, it's really useful to have a single substrate that can span all the environments where you're doing, inference or training. And, turns out Kubernetes is pretty good at that.
Yeah, it definitely allows for some more interesting, deployment models. I really feel like we've been saying information is gold, or we're in the information age, but really now in the last couple of years with, the explosion of Gen AI to sort of the public, I really feel that now, right? That really we're starting to use and or want to use as much data as we can, and it does kind of, become more and more important, especially in these types of workloads. But we know that data is only half the problem, right? In AI, we need specific hardware like GPUs. So curious how that sort of fits into the hybrid cloud landscape. Are we moving towards making that hardware available at the edge or in multi cloud scenarios?
Yeah, so it was pretty cool to see that Kubernetes actually early on introduced this concept of device plugins, which allows you to expose specialized hardware. And I think NVIDIA GPUs were the first, or one of the first, types of hardware that were exposed like this. And now there's all kinds of other plugins like AMD and Intel and any vendor can build a device plugin for their specialized hardware. And so that allows users to very easily schedule their workloads on nodes that have that specialized hardware available. And availability is really the key issue here, right? I think something like half of NVIDIA's GPUs just go to the big clouds and Facebook and maybe Tesla now. And so I think for many organizations, it's just really hard to even get access to GPUs, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's another reason for just building infrastructure where you can move things around when you have to, right? You might be training this generation of model on, say your favorite public cloud, but then your next generation of a model where, maybe you looked at the costs and you're like, wow, this cloud is really expensive. Maybe it's time for me to buy some stuff or go to a, GPU specific cloud. There's several companies that spun up specifically for AI training. And so, building on Kubernetes, I think, is a great way to just leave those options open, right?
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
I know we spoke to another guest who, because of this availability problem, even as an individual, as a consultant, right, was fed up, right? And with the major public clouds trying to get access, and he's like, I'm just going to buy some and set up a GPU, infrastructure in my home office kind of a thing. So I guess how do those AI or GPU specific hyperscalers fit in, right? Are we going to see more and more use of those versus the big names and hyperscalers that we see, or what do you think there?
I think there's so much demand for, AI silicon, I'll call it, primarily GPUs, but we're also seeing, some other silicon like, TPUs and other, other types of, there's all these new names coming up. There's TPUs and DPUs and whatever. I think XPU, just because there's so much demand, I think we'll see a lot of use of all of those things, just out of necessity.
Okay. And I had a follow-up question, right? I was listening to another podcast, I think where Jensen Huang was talking about the current model of the GPUs that NVIDIA is selling today, and then the next one, and how we'll see the performance improvement. But he also mentioned that the interviewer mentioned that your models that you're training today on a specific set of GPUs might be the only use for those set of GPUs or for that generation, because your next model, which you want to be even better, would need more processing power and will need more, or the newer family of GPUs. How are organized, like with the customers that you are talking to or industry people that you are talking to, how do you see that balance, right? Are they going all in with the H200s? Are they waiting a year and then maybe buying 25% now and then allocating rest of the budget for future? How do organizations manage that balance?
Yeah, it's a good point. The lifespan of that hardware is very short, it seems like. It's just because of the leaps in every generation. I mean, it's so expensive to train a large model. So, buying the next generation, which might be, 2-3x more efficient, makes a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. But, frankly, I mean, so we work with a lot of large organizations typically. So, large enterprises, Global 2000s. And, frankly, most of them are just dipping their toes in the water. So, they're buying something to get started, frankly, or they're renting something to get started. I see, very few that are, sort of like at the point where they've already built multiple model generations and, they're really optimizing things. I think it's just early. So, they'll buy what's currently available and they're still kind of in the getting started phase.
Gotcha. I think, as you said, right, like if Meta or Elon Musk don't want those GPUs, the previous generation, I think that's when everybody else can get their hands on those GPUs. So,
check the flea markets.
Do you see people building out these environments on their own or just renting for training use cases, right? I know I like the way you split it, like training and inference. And if I'm deploying AI applications on Kubernetes closer to my data, I'm more worried about inference. Are people just focusing on that and then renting out capacity in the cloud if they can? Or maybe just consuming open source models and figuring out, okay, let's try to do inference with those rather than trying to build or train their own proprietary model?
It's really all of it, depending on the use case. I think some of the first use cases where a lot of organizations are getting started are, the customer support bots, for example, or like internal document search, a search engine across all the different document repositories I have. And so really what they're doing is RAG, right? Retrieval augmented generation. for which you typically don't need to train your own models, right? Unless you are in a very, very specific domain. Let's say you're doing, like bioscience, and there's a lot of, specific terminology and stuff. So I think a lot of organizations for that, it's more about, setting up the RAG infrastructure and bringing in the right compute to run an off-the-shelf open source model, or a model from one of their favorite vendors. So they'll most organizations that I work with do want to run their models locally, though. So they're not really comfortable using a public API, a cloud-based model, and sending their data there, right? Because for these use cases, it's very sensitive data that they're dealing with, right? Customer support interactions, they need to protect the customer data, of course. Internal document search, that's their IP, right? Their core crown jewels. Code, the sort of coding copilot is another pattern. It's their code, right? That's also intellectual property.
Oh, yeah.
So really what they want to do, again, is move the compute to their data, where, the data sits in an environment that they have control over and governance rules. And so, typically what they do is they'll buy hardware from their favorite hardware vendor, right? All the hardware vendors now have servers with GPUs that you can just buy and run there. NVIDIA sells stuff too. People use those a lot as workstations for development. And for training, it's, I would say, see very few organizations that are doing fine tuning or their own training, really just because most organizations are getting started with the easier use cases. But those that do that, I think it's really a mix. Like, a lot of people are trying to use the cloud for that just because they don't want to commit to a big, upfront purchase yet, since they're still experimenting. Others that are a little further along, they are making purchases and sort of refining and fine tuning their own models.
Gotcha. No, thank you for sharing that.
As we talk more and more about these use cases, it's very clear to me that, if you're implementing AI and creating your own models, it's sort of this ever evolving, ever living thing, right? Because we're constantly looking at new data, and we're trying to get the hardware to train these things. And one of the reasons I think we spoke about was because models can degrade over time or drift over time. And I guess I'm curious about your perspective on the whole idea of model drift and how to detect when you're running in production. Is there sort of like a standard for how often you should be, regenerating with new data, or how do you test for it? Those kind of things.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we see that a lot with predictive models. A very simple example is, let's say you're running some kind of website and you're storing information about your user demographic, right? Like how many users are 10 to 20 years old, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, and so on. And you have some kind of model that, predicts maybe purchasing behavior or whatever, right?
Yep.
And then you're running a large ad campaign that now drives one of those cohorts to your website. And now your distribution across these buckets changes, right? Now, all of a sudden, let's say you have a ton of 20 to 30-year-olds that you didn't have before. Now that's called data drift, right? Now your data distribution is different than the distribution that your model was trained on. And it might not give you good results anymore, right? And so the general approach to this is, as often with production systems, first of all, measure everything. Just record model decisions. How much did it decide, one way or another, and then also record your data distribution, right? Your new data that's coming in, and then see if those metrics change, right? Like, let's say the model had about a 50-50, decision between two different outcomes before, but now you see it kind of skewing to one. Okay, something's off. Might be time to look into it and retrain it. And then the same with the data, right? You can just check how your data is distributed. How often should you do that? Really depends on how often your data is changing. That's going to be very different for different use cases and different data sets.
Yeah.
But yeah, those are some of the basics.
Yeah, and it's not like, you can't just say, use a RAG implementation, because really that's just getting up-to-date information to feed, but the model's still trained on some level of data. So you actually have to retrain and reproduce a new model to sort of fix this drift. I would suspect. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's right. And so the example I gave, that was more, a predictive model, which that's the stuff that was cool before LLMs and Gen AI, right? That's all it was. For Gen AI, there are different quality metrics we can look at, right? I think what's just really important there for RAG use cases and others with LLM is the human feedback, right?
Yeah,
so logging that, simple thumbs up, thumbs down. Did I like this answer that it gave me or not? There's many other techniques too. Like we can probably do a whole nother episode around this. You can use you can use an LLM to judge the answers that another LLM gave, right? There's lots you can do there.
No, that's awesome, right? Like going back to the data drift, I think that was definitely something I wasn't thinking about when I was thinking about drift when it comes to AI applications. So thank you for sharing that perspective. And I think even Oxford Dictionary every year has to add a few words. So if you have a model that is trained on an older data set, even with RAG or without RAG, you still need to make sure that it's updated every year or every 6 months and to just keep up with what's going on in the ecosystem. So I think that helps. One question is, like, are there tools already? Like, I like the idea of one LLM overlooking the shoulder or looking over the shoulder of another LLM. I know we are using that in some sort of like synthetic data generation or synthetic data generation today. But I like the idea. Do you see any tools that are out there that are doing this, or this is just a one way that you think this can be solved?
Now, there's tons of tools out there. In fact, I think there has been this sort of Cambrian explosion of Gen AI tool startups and open source projects over the last year or two. There's tons of stuff out there. Some are making it really easy to use. There's like SaaS products that you can hook into your pipeline, and they'll do things like LLM as a judge and give you quality metrics and things like that. So there's some easy to use stuff out there.
That's awesome. Okay. So I think talking about data and talking about AI models, like how are organizations dealing with data security? Like one thing we know at this point is, run your compute closer to the data. I think we have established that. But how do we still make sure that there's no data leakage or there are no vulnerabilities in this AI stack that can be exploited? Like how do organizations maintain that same security posture for this new type of applications?
Yeah, it's an evolving space, but it really starts with the basics, right? Let's say you have a very sensitive data set. Let's say it's like your intellectual property, and it's stored in some kind of system. You've already done a lot to secure the data there. Now, let's say you have access control rules. Only certain people can access that data. You're going to want to expand those same access control rules to the AI system, the model that uses that data to do RAG, right? So, one of the things that our AI product does, for example, you can just set access control rules, right, to the model endpoint, so that it's not open to the world, because you can definitely ask that model to, give you all the secrets. It has access to the whole thing. So that's one of the basic items, right? Like make sure that endpoint is protected, make sure there are good access control rules on it. But then, it goes further than that, right? Because you might want to set some rules around what the model can respond with. So, obviously what you can do is you can, instead of giving the model access to everything you have, maybe you say, just don't even feed it the data in the first place. Would be, a straightforward way to do it. Like maybe, the thing that your smartest engineers are working on right now, the product you want to launch next year, maybe keep that away. But you can also do, and this is how a lot of the, like ChatGPT and other public services we can use, they don't allow you to do everything, right? You can't, if you want to do harm in some way, right? Like they have rules built in that, they're not going to give you an evil master plan and things like that. So, and that's a model too that puts these checks and balances in place, right? So you can have another model that has certain rules around what content it considers allowed and not allowed. So it'll check the output of the first model and say like, oh, this output talks about violence, for example, or some other category you want to you want to prevent, and then that way you kind of filter the output before it goes to the user.
Interesting. So I think when you mentioned that the models, the people that are developing these models are putting things in check, there's also the other way, or this more cynicistic way of looking at it, right? Like what happens when Hugging Face, right? Like it will cross 1 million open source models in, I think, next month. That's your trajectory. If I'm just looking at random models, similar to how I was just downloading random packages or random container images and running them, I'm just looking without completely vetting or knowing what's inside a specific model. I'm just running it in production or running it on my data. Are there tools out there? I know we have solved it for Kubernetes with all the security vendors that even we have had on this podcast, but are there vendors out there in the ecosystem that are looking at certifying or having an SBOM for your LLM models hosted on Hugging Face?
It's a good question. I don't think there's anything like that. Well, there's a whole space that's called, explainability. So it's a whole research category, right? Like trying to explain why a model produced a certain output. I think that's a valuable tool. I think, along these lines, one of the main challenges for most organizations is actually liability. So knowing, okay, which data was this model trained on, right? Like, could this be accidentally trained? Let's say I'm a software company. Could this be accidentally trained on my competitor's software because the competitor, published it in the open accidentally? And now my engineers are using that model to generate code for my product. And, am I going to get sued? That's a key consideration, right? Or with the image generation models too, right? Like, is this trained on famous actors or other people who don't want, their image used in this way, or just
without proper attribution as well. Yep, agreed.
Yeah, exactly. Like just professional photos that have license holders. I'd say that's probably the main question a lot of people are asking is IP law related.
Yeah, it gets interesting, and you could go down a rabbit hole of different use cases, right? The one that always comes up for me is like insurance companies using AI to make decisions and approving you or denying you. And it's not like a human can't make those errors, right?
Yeah.
We tend to forget that humans make mistakes all the time when we're being scared by AI. But I think the point is like there absolutely needs to be checks and balances, whether it's some new technology that can crack open an AI model and tell you what's inside of it, like it can a Docker image.
Yeah.
I don't know, if that can be done, but
that's what explainability tries to do. Yeah.
Yeah. Nice. Okay. So, we talked a little bit about how Kubernetes can help AI in terms of deployment, in terms of GPU plugins and those kind of things, but let's reverse it, right? How can AI help Kubernetes?
Yeah, I think it can help in a big way. We talked about the skills gap earlier. I think that's a great place to start. So, just having all of that Kubernetes knowledge at your fingertips as a new user. We built a chatbot into our product that does exactly that. It has all the Kubernetes knowledge. It has also our knowledge base. So whenever we our support team ran into an issue with the customer, it's documented in the knowledge base, and you can ask the bot about those things, right? I'm seeing these symptoms. What should I do? Here's a log line I don't understand. Or, what are the best practices for securing my containers or whatever it is, right? So that was a pretty straightforward thing to build, frankly. But it's really, really powerful because I think it's just such an accelerant to, not have to file a support ticket when you don't know what to do or do a long Google search. It's just right there. And even better, the bot actually has access to your environments. So you can also ask it about your clusters. Like, is anything crashing right now? Do any of the workloads need attention? Is anything over provisioned or under provisioned? So I think that's really, really powerful. And I hope we can finally close the skills gap around Kubernetes using AI that way. And then the other thing you can do, and that's actually been done in operations for quite some time. AI ops has been a term for quite a while. You can use it to do anomaly detection, for example, or just predicting trends, right? So anomaly detection, let's say, so a common issue with as you try to scale Kubernetes is at some point etcd gets really busy, right? etcd, the database where everything is stored, and people sometimes forget to scale etcd as they scale their clusters, right? Make sure it has enough IO available so it can write, its log, etc. And when etcd hits its limits, if you're not an expert, the symptoms you see are kind of weird. You see leader elections and things like that. So we could use anomaly detection to actually root cause that kind of problem, to say, all right, we see a lot of etcd leader elections. We also see a lot of IO on the etcd nodes. Those two things are related, right? Let's pinpoint the problem and root cause it for users and say, you have a lot of IO going on. Let's maybe even figure out who's causing that IO, right? Which process or container is doing that, so you can stop it and potentially scale your nodes. So that kind of anomaly detection, I think, is a great area. And then just doing predictive analytics. I always use the simple example of pretty much any monitoring tool has thresholds for all kinds of metrics, right? Your disk is 80% full right now, or it's 90% full right now, and or your CPU load is at 90%, right? Stuff's already bad. But what if we just use a predictive model to say, hey, at the current trend, your disk will be 80% full in 4 hours. So you have enough time to fix it, right? Do something about it. I think those are all just some examples of how AI can really help Kubernetes. And there's some cool community projects too, right? There's a thing called K8GPT. It's a nice little tool that, also just kind of chat interface that tells you things about your cluster.
Yeah, I think that the whole space with the skills gap, because this comes up all the time still, right, is it's such an ever evolving and fast moving ecosystem that it's so hard to keep up to date, and we're in a world, I think, with CKA and other things like that, you might feel out of date the moment you get it, so to speak. So these tools like K8GPT that sort of are a virtual sort of SRE, it's definitely not trying to, in my opinion, not trying to replace you as an SRE or someone who knows Kubernetes, but hopefully make you more efficient. Because at the end of the day, even if a model can spit back to you, if you asked it a question of, hey, is anything crashing or is anything filling up, you still kind of have to understand what it's telling you afterwards. Absolutely. Right?
Well, and let's not forget, these things hallucinate, right? Yeah. So that's a real thing. So you definitely need the human in the loop. I think we're still pretty far away from letting models automatically run our clusters.
Sure.
Although I think we can get there. I think that's part of my vision of the future.
Yeah.
But no, to your point, the way I think about it is, we used to use screwdrivers and now we have a power drill. But we still need the human to operate it.
Man, I love that analogy. No, I think it makes me think of I think when Steve Jobs said, right, computer is just a bicycle for people that don't like walking or something like that, gives you that additional leverage. Tobi, I had a question around given you have spent a lot of time both in the Kubernetes ecosystem and now in AI, are there any specific projects that people should start looking at, start experimenting with, both on the training side, on the inferencing side, or maybe on the AI plus Kubernetes side?
So many.
Probably too many.
Yeah, just list it out. We'll include everything in the show notes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, honestly, so I mentioned K8GPT. That's pretty cool. Kserve for serving models on top of Kubernetes. But there's really a long list. There's Kubeflow for building end-to-end AI pipelines, but so many others. And honestly, a great place to start, I think, is either go to KubeCon personally if you can, or just look at the schedule online. Yes. Because, KubeCon has really become AICon. It was that last year, and it's, just looking at the schedule, it's the same thing again this year. That's how you find out about exciting projects too.
Oh, that would be fun, right? Like, I think, so I used to go to VMworlds as a conference for like 5 years straight last decade. And one thing that a technical evangelist did was he had a GitHub of all the interesting sessions and links to those. So it was easy to find that out. I think we need an AI bot that's trained on all the KubeCon sessions. So instead of watching all like 40 hours worth of content on one topic, it can just look at all the sessions and tell me what's important or which session
Summarize
I should try.
Summarize it. That sounds like a nice weekend project.
Yeah, I know. Like, we are here on this podcast all about giving ideas. We should start like keeping track. But
I'll expect a prototype in a couple weeks. Okay,
Tobi, one more follow-up, right? Like, that's for work related. How are you using AI today to experiment with things or just keep up? Like, what's your personal side story?
Yeah, so it's definitely one of my passions. I did I've been doing a lot of infrastructure stuff over the last decade and a half, but also AI. I did my master's in, it was called machine learning at the time. Now we just call everything AI. And so, I have that itch to just, keep up with things that are happening. And so, I built little things on the side. I started, my kids are really into Legos. I have little kids. And so, when you build Legos and you have to like find that one little Lego out of this ocean of Legos.
Yeah.
So it's like, well, that sounds like a job for an image model to just, recognize that one little piece. You just move your phone over all the Legos and it, starts vibrating when it finds the one. Nice. So I started hacking on that a little bit. It's not done. And I also just started, so many documents on my computer and online. So I'm like, that sounds like a good job for a RAG type system. So hacking with things like LangChain or Llama Index to build like a simple RAG application to like just find my own stuff. That was another cool little side project.
Like if you, I don't know if you open source these things, but you should. Like I would download that RAG thing in an instant. Just like give it access, run it locally on my MacBook, and then use that to ask questions. So that's awesome.
Yeah, the amount of information in our personal lives alone, we can each have our own little personal model built on our own lives where we can say, what am I supposed to do today?
I try to use Notion for that, like just personally put everything that I do, personal, professional, everything in Notion, and then hopefully the Notion search is good enough. It's improving for sure as that place, but everything outside in terms of documents, I have no way of knowing what's where.
No, it's true. And I mean, those tools, they're usually good at finding the right document for you, but then you still have to read the document. And so with a RAG system, it can read the document for you and like, extract the sentence that matters or summarize it for you or whatever you need.
Great. Well, it sounds like you're going to be at KubeCon. So, where can people learn more about what you're working on these days? Maybe that's your day job or what you're doing at KubeCon. A little bit more about that, and maybe if you have any places where people can go either to find you personally on social media or anything else, or what you do for work. This would be the time for sure.
Definitely. So I will be at KubeCon. So I'll probably be spending quite a bit of time at the booth. So look for the Nutanix booth. And happy to chat with anybody about whatever questions you have. You can learn more about what I do professionally at the company on our blog. We blog about our new product releases and some other things. So it's just nutanix.com/blog. And on social media, I'm on Twitter. My handle is SuperGunter. It's kind of an alter ego I made up. And also on LinkedIn, I post things all the time.
Sweet. Well, Tobi, I know it sounds like we'll have to have you back just to talk about model drift because we have a whole other episode on that one. But it was really a pleasure. I think this topic is one that everybody's sort of reaching out and learning more about. So hopefully our listeners picked up a lot about it, and we'll ask some more. But hopefully we'll have you back in the future. But thanks for coming on. I appreciate it.
Thanks again for having me, guys. That was super fun.
All right, Bhavin, that was a fun conversation with Tobi. I'd love to hear what you thought about that.
Oh, always a fun conversation when you're talking about AI. Like, no, I think we have done a lot of in detail episodes around different pieces of the AI pipeline or stack and covered different open source projects and vendors. This was a fun conversation with somebody who has been in the Kubernetes/container ecosystem for 10 plus years, and to get his perspective on where he sees things evolving. How can Kubernetes keep up? I think the discussion that we had around how do we get like custom accelerated hardware and custom ASICs and all of these things that are being built by hardware providers to accelerate inferencing. Like for training, I think NVIDIA has like conquered the market and they are the vendor to go to. But I think for inferencing, there is being work done, and the way we spoke about device plugins and how Kubernetes can leverage all the new types of hardware. I think that was an interesting discussion. Also liked his perspective around the model drift and the data drift, especially. I know I called it out during the episode as well. Like data drift.
We need a whole other episode on that.
Yeah. I wasn't thinking about data drift at all. And how it impacts,
there's such interesting problems there, right? Just even like the pandemic can change data from when a model was built, right? Or spammers, if there's a model used to detect spamming, spammers change their technique, and so it's not, just all sorts of. There's a rabbit hole of information that clearly we could have gone into with Tobi, I think. But I like his perspective there too.
And then the fun projects that he's working on, like, man, that as a GM of a business unit at a publicly traded company, I don't know how you find time, but man, those were fun projects. That like the Lego thing, especially. Yeah.
Well, he did say it wasn't done yet, so maybe that's a insight.
Yeah, with little kids. I haven't even started anything yet, so he already has a leg up on me.
Probably a couple legs up. Yeah. I really liked his comments about how this market is exploding, right? So he mentioned a few things like all the tools and companies around tools are exploding, right? Even if you just follow news feeds and those kind of things, there's new AI tools and new AI projects every 2 seconds everywhere you look. Some of those should be useful, some of them not. But I think it definitely goes to show you, right, where we are in this sort of bell curve. It's like in the middle on the way up where it's like everything is exploding. Even his comment about KubeCon is now AICon. I like that one. And I don't necessarily disagree, although it's not, I don't really love that either. But hey,
but we have seen this transition. Like I think security con and platform engineering con and cost management con.
That's right. Platform engineering con was what, Amsterdam, right, or something? Or maybe the one before that. I'm not sure.
Like the themes always keep changing, but AI has been around, and I think it will be the focus for the next couple at least.
At least the next couple, I would say. So one thing I wanted to key in on, and he might have not even noticed, but he was talking about how they implemented AI models internally on their own data for their own clusters or own whatever it is. And he said that was quite an easy exercise. And he might not have keyed in on that, but I was like, oh wow, like it's an interesting way to think about where something as honestly complex as taking all that data, putting it in a model and making a useful thing out of it. We're at the point, at least in the ecosystem, where someone can think that's quite a simple exercise, right? And with that amount of data, right? And I think all that just keyed in on, I think on we're at this point where we're really thinking about how and where AI can be adopted, and that's why we're seeing this explosion, right? And kind of like applying it to a use case here, applying it to, is it useful here? Is it useful here? Is it useful here? Right? Or to his own life, or as you said, is there one for your own data, right? That's an interesting part of that conversation that I think I really enjoyed.
When he brought that up, I remembered like this week or the week of October, last week of October, Google did its earning report, right? And then they spoke about how 25% of code that's being written over the last quarter is AI generated.
Oh, I did see that. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
So I was like, okay, that's interesting. Like, because we have always seen mixed reactions from people we have spoken to, right? Like, code generation, Copilot, things are great, but then if it introduces a bugs or hallucinates in the code, it takes twice or thrice the amount of time to catch it than it would have taken a good engineer to work on it. So I'm sure, like, again, that's not a model that Google exposes to everyone. It's like the Borg Kubernetes thing where they don't
exactly. I was going to say they've probably been doing this for a long time.
Yeah.
And now they're talking about it. Yeah.
Yep. So the productivity gains that they see, I think that's the next thing I'm looking out for, like how other organizations build something of this using either open source or custom models.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear the correlation between if that percentage of your code is AI generated, did it affect your workforce, or did it just improve their efficiency to write 25% AI generated, or are you have less employees, right? Because I think a lot of people are worried about that too.
No, agreed. And at least for this earnings report, their perspective was it just made our existing employees more productive. Right. Because they were still reviewing the code. Like, it was not AI reviewing AI, as I know Tobi mentioned, like LLMs reviewing some LLM outputs, but this was still humans reviewing the code that's generated by language models.
In the long run, I worry about, like, how long will it take us to get to the point where even if you have turtles all the way down, models all the way down, and models are reviewing output from model, you go all the way down. When do you get to the point where you're like, well, that's enough? Maybe it's just hard to put in my head at the moment, but I don't know. I feel like there's always got to be a guess and check, and even the person reviewing it, like I was giving the example with insurance. Mm-hmm. People make mistakes. Yep. So, AI making a mistake. Well, is it worse? Well, maybe it can be sometimes. Yeah. But anyway,
I get it. Cool. I think one thing that puts me at ease is you won't be replaced by AI. I think you will be replaced by a person who knows how to leverage AI, at least for in 2024 or 2025. But then in the future, who knows? So
mic drop.
Yes, let's go.
All right. Well, Bhavin, that brings us to the end of another episode. I'm Ryan.
I'm Bhavin.
And thanks for listening to another episode of Kubernetes Bytes. Thank you for listening to the Kubernetes Bytes podcast.